Imagine standing in the shadow of history's most famous execution, a man condemned, nailed to a cross, and left to die. But what became of those who orchestrated it? For 2,000 years, Christians have asked not only why Jesus had to die, but also what happened to the men who betrayed, condemned, and mocked him. This video is not just about the crucifixion, it's about the unsettling aftermath. Judas Iscariot, who sold Jesus for 30 silver coins. Pontius Pilate, the governor who washed his hands but could not wash away his guilt. Caiaphas, the high priest who pushed for execution at any cost. And Herod Agrippa, who sought glory by persecuting Christ's followers. Their names are infamous, but their deaths are often overlooked. What you'll see is more than a historical record. It's a chilling reminder of how power, pride, and betrayal can destroy a man from within. Some died violently, others in shame, but none escaped the shadow of the choice they made. So, what really happened to the men who killed Jesus? And do their fates still speak to us today? Let's uncover the forgotten endings to one of history's most haunting stories. Judas Iscariot, the price of betrayal. Among all the names linked to the crucifixion of Jesus, none carries the same weight of infamy as Judas Iscariot. His very name has become synonymous with treachery. But who was Judas really? And how did his story spiral into one of history's most notorious acts of betrayal? To understand his end, we have to go back to the beginning. Judas was not an outsider when he first followed Jesus. He was chosen as one of the 12 disciples, entrusted with responsibility, even holding the group's common purse. This role shows he wasn't immediately viewed with suspicion. In fact, it suggests he was once trusted. That fact alone makes his later betrayal all the more shocking. For 30 pieces of silver, roughly the price of a common slave, he handed over the man he had traveled with, eaten with, and listened to for years. The act was not just a betrayal of a friend, but a rejection of the message he had once pledged to follow. What drove Judas? Historians and theologians have debated this for centuries. Some argue greed played the central role, pointing to his position as treasurer and occasional dishonesty with money. Others believe he was disillusioned, expecting Jesus to lead a political uprising against Rome, only to find that Christ's kingdom was not of this world. Still others see in Judas a tragic pawn, manipulated by religious authorities or even by darker spiritual forces. Whatever the motive, his choice became the turning point that set in motion Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. But betrayal, once committed, rarely brings peace. After the arrest, Judas was consumed with regret. The Gospels tell us he returned the silver coins, confessing, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." Yet remorse without redemption is a heavy burden. The chief priests dismissed his confession coldly, leaving him with no relief, no forgiveness. In despair, Judas flung the money into the temple and went out to take his own life. His death, by hanging, was as tragic as his betrayal. The field bought with the returned coins became known as the Field of Blood, a chilling legacy tied forever to his name. Why does this matter today? Because Judas is not just a figure of the past, he is a mirror. His story reminds us that betrayal is not always distant or dramatic. It can be as simple as sacrificing principles for personal gain, silencing conscience for comfort, or choosing self-interest over loyalty. How many times in our modern world do people trade integrity for profit, status, or fleeting approval? Judas's 30 pieces of silver may look different today. Perhaps a promotion earned by cutting corners, a friendship abandoned for convenience, or truth denied for popularity. But the cost is just as real. As we continue this journey, remember Judas' fate is only the first of several. He represents betrayal, but others who played their part in Jesus' death, Roman governors, priests, and kings, would also find their lives ending in shame, violence, or despair. Their stories remind us that the consequences of rejecting truth ripple far beyond the moment of choice. Pontius Pilate, the governor who couldn't escape his own verdict. If Judas symbolizes betrayal from within, Pontius Pilate embodies the weakness of power without conviction. Pilate was the Roman prefect of Judea, appointed by the emperor to keep order in a volatile province. His job was not easy. Jewish leaders resisted Roman rule, rebellions simmered often, and Pilate's main duty was to maintain peace, especially during festivals like Passover, when Jerusalem swelled with crowds. In this setting, Jesus was brought before him. The Gospels portray Pilate as reluctant, even uneasy. He interrogated Jesus, questioned the accusations, and famously declared, "I find no fault in this man." Yet despite this declaration, Pilate did not act according to his conscience. Pressured by the religious elite and an angry crowd, he chose political survival over justice. By washing his hands in front of the mob, he tried to absolve himself. "I am innocent of this man's blood." But history remembers him not as innocent, but as complicit. This detail speaks volumes. How many times in history, and even in our own lives, do leaders try to distance themselves from responsibility while still enabling injustice? Pilate's symbolic washing of hands remains a metaphor for moral cowardice, an attempt to escape guilt while allowing wrong to proceed. It's a warning against the illusion that neutrality is possible when truth and injustice stand in direct opposition. What happened to Pilate afterward? Historical sources outside the Bible, such as the Jewish historian Josephus and Roman writers, give us glimpses. Pilate's rule was marked by repeated conflict with the Jewish people. He provoked outrage by bringing Roman standards into Jerusalem, clashed with locals over the use of temple funds, and violently suppressed protests. His harshness left a bitter legacy. Eventually, after a brutal crackdown on a Samaritan uprising, Pilate was reported to Rome for excessive cruelty, removed from office. He was sent back to face judgment before the emperor. But here, accounts diverge. According to some traditions, Pilate was exiled and eventually committed suicide. Others suggest he was executed by Roman authorities. Still others, particularly in Eastern Christian tradition, claim he experienced a form of repentance. In fact, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Pilate is even regarded as a saint, a startling reversal that reflects the complexity of how his story was remembered across cultures. Regardless of the version, his fall from power was steep. From the governor's palace to disgrace and death, Pilate's name became synonymous with failed leadership. There's a sobering lesson here. Trying to keep everyone happy often pleases no one and destroys yourself in the process. Pilate wanted to appease the Jewish leaders, pacify the crowd, and protect his own career, all while knowing Jesus was innocent. In the end, he lost everything. His attempt to stand in the middle only ensured he stood on the wrong side of history. We can see echoes of Pilate's dilemma in modern times. Think of politicians who sacrifice integrity for votes, business leaders who ignore ethics for profit, or individuals who remain silent when speaking up could cost them. The temptation to wash our hands of responsibility is timeless. But as Pilate discovered, silence in the face of injustice is itself a decision, and it carries consequences. What makes Pilate's story especially tragic is that he had opportunities to act differently. He had the authority to release Jesus. He even received a warning from his wife, who dreamed of Jesus and urged him to avoid involvement in that righteous man's death. Yet Pilate ignored the warnings, chose the path of least resistance, and condemned an innocent man. His downfall reminds us that the weight of our choices often comes not from dramatic actions but from failures to act when we should. As we leave Pilate behind, the story widens. He was not the only leader who schemed against Jesus. The Jewish high priest Caiaphas, who engineered the trial, and the King Herod Agrippa, who later persecuted Christians, also faced terrible ends. Each reveals a different facet of what happens when pride, fear, or ambition blinds men to truth. And in their stories, too, we'll find not just ancient history but timeless warnings for our own age. Caiaphas, the high priest who lost everything. If Judas embodies betrayal and Pilate represents weakness, then Caiaphas symbolizes calculated opposition. As the Jewish high priest, Caiaphas was not simply a religious figure. He was a political operator in a fragile system. His role was deeply tied to Rome, balancing the demands of the empire with the traditions of his people. In many ways, Caiaphas's power depended on keeping the peace, even if it meant compromising justice. That context explains why Jesus quickly became a threat in his eyes. The Gospels paint Caiaphas as the architect of the trial. When crowds began to follow Jesus, when whispers of miracles and messiahship spread, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin grew alarmed. They feared that if Rome saw Jesus as a revolutionary leader, the entire nation would suffer. But their concern was not only national, it was personal. Jesus challenged their authority, exposed their hypocrisy, and overturned their power base. The cleansing of the temple, when Jesus drove out the money changers, struck directly at the heart of their influence. Caiaphas understood, if Jesus continued, his own position would collapse. Thus, Caiaphas declared it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. On the surface, his words seemed pragmatic, a political calculation to prevent chaos. Yet history reveals the irony. In trying to preserve the nation by silencing Jesus, he instead ensured the rise of a faith that would transform the world, leaving his own legacy in ruins. But what became of Caiaphas after the crucifixion? Ancient sources provide fragments of his story. We know that within just a few years, Caiaphas was removed from office. This was unusual, since high priests often served for life. His removal suggests he lost favor with Roman authorities or lost his grip on the people he once controlled. Without the robes of power, he faded into obscurity, remembered not for his leadership, but for presiding over one of history's most infamous trials. Traditions about his death are less clear. Some suggest he died in disgrace, stripped of the honor that once defined him. Archaeologists in the 1990s discovered a 1st century ossuary inscribed with the name Caiaphas, containing the remains of a man believed by many to be the high priest himself. If true, it's a chilling discovery. The bones of the man who sentenced Jesus now rest in a stone box, mute testimony to the fleeting nature of power. He who once stood in judgment is now judged by history. Caiaphas's downfall carries a timeless lesson about leadership corrupted by fear. He feared losing influence more than he feared losing integrity. In many ways, he represents every leader who sacrifices principle to maintain control. His story is echoed in corporate boardrooms, political halls, and even religious institutions today. How often do leaders protect their own positions at the expense of truth? How often do they silence voices that challenge the status quo instead of listening? Caiaphas' life warns us. When power becomes the ultimate goal, it blinds us to justice. If Judas shows us how greed corrupts, and Pilate shows us how cowardice destroys, Caiaphas demonstrates how pride blinds. He thought he was protecting his people, but he was protecting himself. And in the end, he lost not only his position but his place in history as a respected leader. All that remains is the shadow of his decision, a reminder that clinging to power can cost us the very things we hope to preserve. As we turn from Caiaphas, the story of Jesus' execution widens again. Beyond the betrayer, the governor, and the high priest, there were kings, like Herod Agrippa, who mocked and persecuted Jesus' followers in pursuit of their own glory. Their stories, too, ended in ways that revealed the futility of fighting against truth. Each man's downfall adds another layer to the haunting legacy of those who played a role in killing Christ. Herod Agrippa weren't, the king who was eaten by worms. If Caiaphas represents pride within the religious system, Herod Agrippa represents arrogance on the throne. He was a king with Roman backing, ruling Judea with ambition and flair. Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great, the same Herod who ordered the massacre of infants at Bethlehem. Power, cruelty, and politics ran deep in his family line. By the time he rose to rule, he had learned how to maneuver between Roman emperors and Jewish leaders, playing both sides to maintain his throne. At first glance, Agrippa appeared shrewd and successful. He enjoyed the favor of Emperor Caligula and later Claudius, expanding his territory until he ruled over nearly as much land as his grandfather once did. To his Jewish subjects, he presented himself as a pious king, carefully observing Jewish customs to secure their loyalty. But beneath this public image, Agrippa sought one thing above all else: glory. That pursuit brought him into direct conflict with the followers of Jesus. In the book of Acts, we see Agrippa persecuting the early church. He arrested Christians to win favor with Jewish leaders and even executed James, the brother of John, the first apostle to be martyred after the resurrection. When he saw that this brutality pleased the religious elite, Agrippa imprisoned Peter as well, intending to make him a public example. But Peter's miraculous escape from prison, aided by an angel, thwarted the king's plan and exposed the limits of his power. Still, Agrippa's reign seemed strong, until one fatal day. Acts 12 records the moment that sealed his fate. Agrippa appeared before a crowd in Caesarea, dressed in royal robes that shimmered in the sunlight. The people, eager to flatter him, shouted, "This is the voice of a god, not of a man." Instead of rejecting the blasphemous praise, Agrippa basked in it. He received worship that belonged to God alone. In that instant, Scripture says, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Josephus, the Jewish historian, corroborates the story, describing how Agrippa was suddenly struck with severe abdominal pain during the festival, and after 5 days of agony, collapsed and died. The detail of being consumed by worms likely points to parasitic infection, horrifying imagery that underscored his fall from glory. This death was more than biological, it was symbolic. Agrippa had clothed himself in shining garments, but they could not shield him from decay. He exalted himself as divine, only to be reduced to a rotting corpse. The contrast is brutal. A king adored by crowds one moment, lying helpless in agony the next. His end reminds us that no throne, no title, no applause can protect a man who confuses himself with God. There is a chilling lesson here for any age. Agrippa's story exposes the danger of living for human approval. He executed Christians not out of conviction, but because it made him popular. He embraced divine praise because it fed his ego. How often do we see this pattern today? Leaders, influencers, or celebrities tailoring their actions to win applause, only to find themselves enslaved by the very crowd they seek to please. Public approval can be intoxicating, but it is also fragile. It can vanish overnight, leaving only emptiness. Herod Agrippa's fate also contrasts sharply with the people he persecuted. James, whom Agrippa executed, died with his faith intact, remembered as a martyr. Peter, whom he imprisoned, lived to preach and strengthen the early church. And Agrippa himself, though he seemed the most powerful, died in disgrace, remembered for worms rather than wisdom. It's a stark reversal. Those who appeared weak were vindicated, while the king who seemed untouchable fell in humiliation. When we piece together the stories of Judas, Pilate, Caiaphas, and now Herod Agrippa, a pattern emerges. Each man who opposed Jesus, whether through betrayal, cowardice, pride, or arrogance, suffered a downfall that mirrored his choices. Their deaths were not just biological events but moral conclusions, revealing the cost of resisting truth. And yet, their stories also serve as warnings and mirrors for us. We are not detached spectators. Their fates ask us to examine our own lives. When we trace the fates of Judas, Pilate, Caiaphas, and Herod Agrippa, their deaths are grim reminders that history does not simply record what people did, it judges what they became. Yet if we stop at the horror of their endings, we miss the deeper point. Their stories are not preserved simply to shock us, but to provoke us. The real question is not how they died, but why their choices led there. What binds them together is not the method of their deaths, but the posture of their hearts. Judas sold his soul for silver. Pilate abandoned truth for political safety. Caiaphas sacrificed justice for power. Herod Agrippa worshipped himself instead of God. Different men, different paths, but each allowed fear, ambition, or pride to govern the final chapters of their lives. And that is what truly destroyed them. The lesson is not locked in the past. It confronts us now. Every generation faces the temptation to trade conscience for convenience, to silence truth in order to keep peace, or to chase applause at the cost of integrity. These men are remembered not because they lived ordinary lives, but because they stand as warnings of what happens when power outweighs principle. For you, the viewer, the question becomes personal. What governs your choices? Is it fear of others, hunger for status, or the weight of guilt? Or is it the quiet strength of conviction? Unlike the figures we've studied, our stories are still being written. We can choose differently. The men who killed Jesus are gone, their power long dissolved into dust. But the man they condemned, Jesus himself, remains the most enduring figure in human history. That contrast alone should make us pause. Kingdoms fall, but truth endures. Pride crumbles, but grace restores. So as you step away from this story, carry this thought with you. It is not the manner of your death that defines you, but the compass of your life. The end of Judas, Pilate, Caiaphas, and Agrippa does not have to be ours. Their failures light the warning signs. Their graves point us back to the path of courage, humility, and hope. And maybe that is the ultimate irony. Their horrible deaths, far from silencing the story of Jesus, only magnified its meaning for generations to come.